Hello and welcome to the Microbiome Medics podcast. I'm Dr. Siobhan McCormack.
And I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and we're your co-hosts.
We are both GPs and lifestyle medics with a shared passion for microbiome science. We'll be translating the evidence and packaging it into actionable, bite-sized chunks so that you can harness the power of the microbiome to improve your own health and that of your patients.
Hello and welcome to another Microbiome Medics podcast. So I'm joined today by Siobhan McCormack. She's here in person and we're both in Glasgow. Absolutely delighted to have my best buddy up in Glasgow for a change. We've actually been in Edinburgh this week, Shiv and I. We've been at a food and mood event put on by BSLM. And we were presenting with the team from Deakin University Research Centre in Australia. Felice Jacka and Tatiana Rocks were the team from over there. And they're amazing scientists that are investigating the relationship between food and mood, doing tons of really innovative research. And it's great to hear from them. We're not going to go into too much detail of what they're doing today, but we're going to be talking a little bit about what we were doing at the conference. And we were talking about sleep, circadian rhythms, and yeah, just a really interesting topic, how it relates to the gut microbiome, how it relates to mood and food. And yeah, we did a lot of research into this, Shiv. So why do you think this is an important one? And, tell us how you're enjoying being here.
Okay, first of all, we are together. And if you listen to us doing podcasts, normally I'm in Church Stratton, Sheena's up here. So it is so nice to be here. It's my first time in Glasgow. Honestly, I've had such a fun time. Okay, first of all, we did this thing in Edinburgh and we are so buzzed up by it. We'll be talking about it on another podcast, but Professor Felice Jacka has just been awarded this amazing prize for her work in food and mood. It's the L'Oreal UNESCO prize. It's very, very fancy, one below the Nobel Prize. And we met with these incredible women who are really pushing lifestyle medicine in psychiatry forward, the whole idea of food and mood. We'll be talking again about them, but, they are an amazing duo and the Deakin team are amazing. So do look up the Deakin Food and Mood Centre and we'll be talking about that on another podcast, but it was great to meet them. It was an incredible meeting. There were forensic psychiatrists there, the psychologists, the yoga teachers. It was really, really buzzy. And so we were very excited by it. So normally when we do talks, we go through the gut microbiome, what it is, but it's always really exciting for us to look at a different angle. So what we wanted to do is bring in another lifestyle pillar. So what circadian rhythm and sleep does with the gut microbiome. But we kind of almost bit off more than we can chew because what we're doing is looking at the gut microbiome. We're looking at circadian rhythms and what sleep does to the gut microbiome. We're looking at food. We're looking at mood. And it was like, the connections are kind of crazy. So we're going to take you through just the concepts really, just to see how it all connects.
First of all, we were thinking about circadian rhythms and what circadian rhythms are. And I think it's another concept that we kind of brushed over in medical school without really fully understanding what actually happens when you have this rhythmic change every day in your physiology and hormone production and things. And circadian rhythms are interesting. They're basically how we've adapted to the light and the dark and these 24-hour cycles of light and dark in the world. And we take these messages from the light, the physiological response to light through our eyes, through the nervous system into our suprachiasmatic nucleus, which sits in our hypothalamus. So, we take the messages as to whether it's light or dark, and that is converted into rhythmic pulses and messages that travel throughout the body to these peripheral clocks, which are clocks situated all throughout the body. And these rhythmic impulses will send these messages to these little peripheral clocks, which will then allow the peripheral clocks to know where they are in the day and what they're supposed to be doing. And a lot of our physiology is dependent on that. So for example, our hormone production can be dependent on that. So certain hormones like melatonin and cortisol and they are produced at a greater quantity at certain times of the day, depending on the levels of light and dark. And just how we metabolize food, for example, can be dependent on the time of day and our responses. So these kind of responses to daylight and dark are really, really important to us.
Yeah, I want to go back even further because I know it sounds ridiculous because obviously it's just something we never think about, the fact that we're constantly rotating. The Earth is constantly rotating around its own axis. It takes circa DM, about a day, to go a full 360-degree rotation. And the fact is that while Sheena and I have been sitting here for the last half hour, we've moved 500 miles without even taking a step. And it's something you don't think about, really. I mean, it feels like we're still because everything and everyone is moving at the same rate. But actually, there's this constant moving and we're moving towards and away from the sun. But I guess the thing that we do all notice is the change in environmental conditions. So we're getting dark light cycles, we're getting warm, cooler cycles, and our body is responding to this. And it affects our behavior, it affects when we work, it affects when we sleep, but it's also affecting these internal biological clocks. So what we're doing is getting, pulsations of hormones, our digestion changes throughout the 24 hours. So I find it incredible that these clocks not only respond to, but they actually anticipate what's going to happen and set off the right hormones at the right time. So it's things like, as Sheena said, your digestion. She talked about what happens when you wake. So you get this cortisol response in the morning. Your cortisol starts to rise. It's like an alarm clock in the morning, and it changes multiple things in your physiology. Your temperature drops slightly in preparation for waking. You're releasing insulin from you're releasing glucose from your pancreas. You're priming your brain for learning and focus and concentration, all sorts of other things. And so your immune system, for example, calms down as well. So it's correct. Multiple processes are affected. And then at the other end of the day, of course, you've got your temperature going up in preparation for sleep and, your melatonin going up. And you're preparing for sleep. So throughout the 24-hour cycle, you digest food differently. Your glucose sensitivity is different. Your certain times of day, you're better at coordination, you're better at focus, you're better at cognition, you're better at exercising. And actually, there's this circadian rhythm to all your physiology and processes. So I know it sounds silly and everyone should know that, but actually doing this talk really made me focus in on that, the fact that we're moving all the time and that our body across evolution, all living organisms have these internal circadian clocks. So, when your blood pressure is going up, when it's going down, and importantly, as primary healthcare physicians, something that we don't talk about at all is that when you're taking drugs, they're metabolized differently at different times of day. And this is really important because, when I tell someone to take a drug, most people say, well, take it in the morning. The reason we do that is because people tend to remember more. But actually, if you take your blood pressure drug in the morning, or if you take it at 6 o'clock in the evening, it has a different, metabolism. So it will affect its the amount that gets into your body, which will affect its efficacy, will affect its toxicity.
Mm-hmm. And its potency.
And its potency. And I know Professor Robert Thomas is really into this because, for example, he's an oncologist and lifestyle medic. It's really important when you're taking various oncology drugs, actually, if the efficacy and the toxicity is changing throughout the day, it really matters when you're taking it. And again, with people doing shift work where they're taking things at different times, they're sort of working one day, so they miss their drugs and take it in the evening. It's really important, this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we then were thinking about sleep and how sleep relates to circadian rhythms. and really the physiology of sleep, because again, we need to understand what it is that's happening when we're sleeping, and what we're doing. So sleep's really interesting. We kind of want to sleep around about the 8 hours, 7 to 9 hours in the night. And during the course of our sleep, we cycle in and out of these little cyclic waves of sleep. Now, in these individual cycles, we're going in and out of sort of light towards deeper sleep. And at the start of the night, so for the first half of the night, we're going into a deeper form of sleep. So we're cycling in. There's 4 stages of sleep. You're starting at stage 1, and you're getting into a deeper sleep as you cycle. And when you're in the stage 4 sleep, it's quite an important time. This is when you can start to produce hormones like growth hormone, ADH, which stops your bladder from working in the night. And you are doing a lot more repair. So these deeper sleeps at the start of the night help you to prepare your body for the next day. So you are repairing, getting rid of any sort of toxins, metabolites that you've used up during the day, and you're just preparing the ground for new day, new physiology, new metabolism, and it's a really important time. So that's the first half of the night. The second part of the night, we're going into longer periods of REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. And REM sleep is when we are starting to process and looking at problem solving. If you've had a difficult situation at work the day before, and you're trying to puzzle what to do or how to work something out, or maybe you've been in emotional turmoil, something that's upsetting you, you need that REM sleep in order to try and figure things out, and try to work forward. So that REM sleep is a really important time. So we're cycling in and out of these little sleep rhythms, but in the latter half of the night, we're spending a longer time frame in this REM sleep, which is helping us to process things. So sleep is a very metabolically active time. So it's a time where we're using a lot of calories, and we're doing a lot. Our body is very active, although we think we're being pretty inactive at the time, but lots is going on. And so it's very, very important that we do get our sleep. And Shiv, how much sleep do we need?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because we always assume that, when you're older, for example, you hardly need any sleep. But actually, if we're looking at 65-year-olds, they still need 7 to 8 hours a day. But if we start when they're younger, I mean, it's always incredible. When you have a newborn, they just seem to sleep all the time, 18 hours a day. And then, as you're getting up to a year, it's 14 to 15 hours a day. And I don't know tell us about your teenagers and what they do.
They're not bad. I have been quite careful to enforce sleep. So they're pretty good at getting their probably about 9 hours sleep a night. And I think, teenagers do need that 8 to 9 hours at least of sleep. So that's important. And if you're an athlete as a teenager, and there are lots of very athletic teenagers, you actually probably need an extra hour. Because your body is doing so much work, and there's so much healing involved, and so they probably do need an additional hour on top.
Yeah. So I guess we're talking 7 to 9 hours, but
8 to 9, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So incredibly important, and it's interesting that we all know that just one night of not sleeping well. I mean, before we did the conference, I'm kind of all excited, didn't sleep very well, and that when you go to work, you haven't slept, your mood is different. I don't know what you're like. I get a bit craggy. I get a bit paranoid. I think I'm annoying everyone, which I probably am. But your food choices are different. Because I try and pack a lunch when I go to work, and if I haven't slept and I'm a bit chaotic, I don't have that nice lunch. And there's something about, I don't know, it's about the NHS. Everyone always seems to bring in sugary donuts. So I just survive the day by loads of coffee, sugary donuts. On the way home, do I go to the gym? No way. I go home and I kind of slump, and I've already had too much coffee, so that I don't sleep so well. So it's definitely, it affects your behaviour. So it will affect your food choices. It will affect your physical activity. Oh, the way you connect with people. You know, you're grumpy with your kids. So actually just even one night really affects all these things. And, you know, for me, I love my sleep. And if I don't get about 8 hours, I just can't really function that well. And it's this idea of, you know, sleep deprivation being torture. And that made me think, it is actually torture. It's used as an instrument of torture, sadly, throughout the world in various interrogation centres. And it's condemned by international bodies. And actually, when I was doing research for this, I kind of thought, that's interesting. And I went and looked, and that sadly is an academic academic publication called Torture, which actually looks at how you help people recover from torture situations, including sleep deprivation. And that was kind of, you know, pretty sobering. So actually I did look into how it affects people, because we were talking about mental health. So there is this bidirectional relationship between mental health and sleep, in that if you have a severe mental health disorder, something like, well, in major depression, something like 92% of people with major depression have a sleep disorder of some kind, you know, insomnia, disrupted sleep. And that's compared to about 12% of those who don't have these severe mental health disorders, so really substantial. But it's also, if you do have a sleep disorder, you have a much higher risk of developing, you know, a variety of mental health disorders. So it's kind of, you know, this bidirectional loop where everything's making everything else worse. So, yeah. But I guess that what we were trying to do with this is with gut, you know, microbiome medics. So we were trying to focus on what role the gut microbiome had in this. So, you know, what were your thoughts about that when you were looking at the, you know, what has the gut got to do with all this kind of sleep, circadian rhythm stuff? Absolutely. And the gut obviously is we think it's an entirely it's really important for every mechanism, every physiology in the body. But there's a connection between the gut microbiome and all of the organs. And we talk about the gut-brain axis, the gut-skin axis, the gut-lung axis. And again, you know, it's worth just going back and thinking about that gut-brain axis and how the gut communicates to the brain, and how important that is. So these two highways between the gut and the brain, the circulation, the nervous system, the vagus nerve being the largest nerve in the human body, and there's information traveling from the gut to the brain via the vagus nerve, but there's also information traveling from the brain to the gut. And with the circulation, we're sending metabolites, we're sending microbes, we're sending hormones that the microbes have produced via the circulation up to the brain and then back again. So there's this bidirectional highway between the gut and the brain, sending information either via nerve impulses, via hormones, via neurotransmitters that are having impacts on our brain function. And that those impacts, you know, will determine our behaviors, our mood, you know, how we feel. Are we sluggish? Are we energized? So all of those things really, really matter. So yeah, and it's, you know, there's so many different things at play. So, you know, it's not just one particular, you know, process that is going to make that communication work. And all of these processes have many different ways of manipulating them as well. So for example, your nervous system is not just impacted by your microbes. You're then going to influence that nervous system via the metabolites from the microbes, and, you know, via feedback from, you know, food impulses and your nutrition. So there's all sorts of things going on there. And, you know, there are many important hormones, for example, melatonin and serotonin, you may have heard of. So they are created in the gut, but we also create some serotonin in the brain, because serotonin doesn't cross that blood-brain barrier. And serotonin, we think, may be related to some mood issues and mood responses. Melatonin is the sleep hormone.
And melatonin's interesting because it fluctuates throughout the day. So you get like peaks and troughs in your melatonin. Melatonin builds towards the end of the day in response to darkness. So when we're responding to those differences in light, we then start to build our quantity of melatonin in our bloodstream, and that's manufactured and created in the gut by with microbes playing a role. And this melatonin, as it rises, it gives us this sleep pressure and this feeling of sleepiness. And it reaches its sort of peak levels at about 2 a.m, and then it starts to decline. And in the morning, when we get up and we expose ourselves to daylight, that melatonin is mopped up, and our levels of melatonin go very low for the day, and then they start to build again in the evening.
Yeah, I just love this idea of all these circadian rhythms happening, sort of, maximum efficiency in the body. And if any of you out there are thinking, wow, you're mentioning lots of different things, it all seems very confusing. I certainly, when I started looking at this, found it confusing. And I like this framework because when I'm talking particularly secondary school students or general public, or even doctors actually, I like to think of it in the same way as we do with social media, because how can something in your gut affect something miles away in your brain? And if we think about how we communicate with people, so you might be in the UK and you might be having a meeting with someone in America, but actually you've got these communication highways, you've got the internet, and that's how I think about the vagus nerve. And I like to think about these different chemicals like languages. So there's lots of different languages. There's the microbial metabolites, there's short-chain fatty acids, there's various hormones, there's neurotransmitters. And if you think of them like lots of different languages communicating with different parts of the body, that becomes an easier framework to understand. Otherwise, it sounds like overwhelming. And certainly the one we talk about, the gut microbiomes a lot, is these short-chain fatty acids, which is produced by the fermentation of fiber that reaches the colon. Remember, your body doesn't have the enzymes to break down this fiber, but your microbes do. And when they break down this fiber, they produce this variety of beautiful metabolites called short-chain fatty acids. Butyrate is probably the best known, but acetate, propionate. And these short-chain fatty acids travel throughout the body. They connect to receptors, the short-chain fatty acid receptors in your brain, in your gut, in your pancreas, in your muscle, in your immune cells, everywhere in the body. They connect to these receptors and set off internal cellular mechanisms that do lots of usually brilliant things for your health. So it's almost like you've got this pharmacy in your gut. And that's just one group. They also make all B vitamins. They're, making lots of neurotransmitters, although Sheena and I are having a little bit of an argument about whether they make all the neurotransmitters or some. So we'll be looking up those papers. But, certainly GABA is produced by, lots of microbes. And that's very important in sleep. So you've all got that communication thing going on. So we're going to park that for a bit, and then let's focus on, should we go to circadian disruption? Kind of, do you want to say just like what it is, and then we can kind of, grab all these bits, talk a bit about them, and then we'll try and pull them all together. So circadian disruption.
I think we've probably all experienced circadian disruption at some stage in our life. That is when we lose those alignments between the body's internal biological clocks and the external environmental cues. What that means is we're not getting that light and dark in the right order. We're not getting the right stimulation to our body to set up those rhythmic rhythms. And that can happen when we turn night into day. So, for example, when we're doing a night shift, if you've ever done any shift work in the past, and that can happen when we are new parents and we have a brand new baby and we're up through the night with this new baby. And it can also happen when you're jet lagged. But the issue with this is that because so much of our physiology and our metabolism is dependent on the light and dark responses being in the right order and the food timings being in the right order, that, when we start changing that around, it confuses the body. And it confuses our physiology. It confuses our cells that are wanting to produce these lovely rhythmic productions of hormones, and those hormone productions go into sort of disarray, and that can have a lot of health consequences. When we're that's one of the reasons why when we're very sleep deprived, we've been up through the night, we are all over the place. Our appetite is altered. We have an increased appetite and we crave the wrong foods. We also have fatigue, and our metabolism changes. So lots of different physiology changes happen when we change this night and day and change the responses here. So yeah, I mean, we talked about shift workers, but if you're a shift worker, sadly, these disruptions to your circadian rhythms will put you more at risk of metabolic issues. So, for example, your cholesterol metabolism might be off. So you're more likely to develop high cholesterol. You're more likely to develop heart problems and be overweight or obese. And you're more likely to develop type 2 diabetes because of this disruption in your normal physiology. So that can be really problematic. There's also a condition called social jet lag. And social jet lag we've probably all experienced, and probably a lot of us do this on a regular basis. But essentially when we're getting up during the week, we might feel that, it's too early for us to get up. So for example, I get up at 6:15 in the week, and at the weekend, the tendency is, I just want to lie in a bit because, I feel like 6:15 is too early for me. So I might change my uptime at the weekend. And if I change it to greater than an hour later than that 6:15 time, then that's me essentially giving myself social jet lag. And it confuses my circadian rhythms when I do that, because my body is expecting that nice rhythmic circadian rhythm that keeps to the same timings. So that can be problematic for us. Even that change of a greater than an hour can be problematic for our metabolism. And up to 70% of us do this when we change our circadian rhythms from weekends to weeks.
I really struggled as a junior doctor. You do these crazy shifts where you kind of come in on Friday morning and you just work. When I was doing pediatrics, you did not stop from Friday morning till Monday evening. You did not have a break at all. And occasionally, if you did go and you sort of lie down somewhere on a sofa somewhere random, you'd go into such a deep sleep and you'd be woken again. And if you think what that does to your memory, cognition, in fact, we did look at quite a few studies. Just even one night's sleep affected people's mood. They got a reduction in mood. This is just one night, not this kind of constant shifting. Affected their mood, food choices. So people crave, ultra processed foods. The calorie intake goes up. I think it's like about 300 calories more. Yeah. So women, there was a group of women. They did this on, and they craved chocolate. So it makes sense to lots of us. Your sort of urge to do physical activity drops. So it kind of disrupts everything. These lifestyle medicine pillars. That's just one night. So you imagine that night after night after night. But the other thing when we were looking at this is it's not just, all these things it affects. It's interesting what it does to the gut microbiome and the gut microbes.
Yeah, and it does disrupt the gut microbes because, certain numbers of your gut microbes, we think around about the 20% mark of your gut microbes actually depend on those lovely rhythms. And so they have periods in the day where they're less active and periods where they're more active, and they take their messages from the circadian clocks in the body to know when to be more active and when to be less active. So these microbes do suffer when we disrupt our circadian rhythms. So their production, their metabolism is not as good, and they don't thrive. The type of microbes that I'm talking about that seem to have this diurnal rhythm, some of these ones are ones that we want a lot of in our body, like lactobacilli, which is the microbe that you see really commonly in your fermented foods. And lactobacilli follows these diurnal patterns and has periods of the day where it's really productive. Generally, when we're sleeping, resting, not eating, it tends to be more active, producing short-chain fatty acids. And when we disrupt those circadian rhythms and we turn night into day, we disrupt these lactobacilli. So that can then affect the numbers of these guys that are thriving in our body. And that obviously has a bad effect on our gut microbiome. So actually that can then in turn affect our clocks. So interestingly, it's not just the clocks that affect the microbes, but the other way around. So, their production, their metabolism, and how many of them they are, that can then influence and feed back to the peripheral clocks and the clocks in the gut. And that can, again, either stabilize or destabilize that circadian pattern. This podcast is funded by the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. The BSLM is an independent charity set up to promote the role of lifestyle medicine in improving people's health and well-being. We empower healthcare professionals to support patients to prevent, manage, and even reverse many chronic conditions through education and connection to our like-minded community. Shiv and I are both members of the BSLM and certified lifestyle medicine practitioners. We authored our first course, The Fundamentals of Gut Microbiome Science, for BSLM. This podcast was created with the aim of improving education on the role of human microbiomes. For those keen on doing a deeper dive, please check out the course on the BSLM Learning Academy page. Listeners to this podcast can access a 10% discount with code MBM10. We're also able to offer all healthcare professional listeners 50% off the first year of membership, unlocking a free overview course and nearly £100 off annual conference tickets, using the code MICROBM in capitals. Now let's get back to the show.
Yeah. I mean, that made me think about, when they're doing all these studies, because on a lot of studies, well, in fact, most of them, I don't think they take into account of when the stool sample is taken. So when you're looking at studies, when they sort of taking people's stool sample and analysing it, it will make a difference when that stool sample was taken and how far before that stool sample was taken someone's eaten and what they've eaten. So there's all these kind of nuances.
And their sleep.
Yeah. So, and their sleep, absolutely. All these other things will really affect the microbiome composition at that. It's almost like a photo in time. And so if, for example, Sheena, I did a stool analysis on you, you'd had a lousy night's sleep, or you missed food, or you had loads of, chocolate and donuts because you were trying to stay awake, coffee. And then I compared it to a couple of days later when you were well rested, you got your food back in, sync, and you were eating sort of, gut microbiome, healthy stuff. Your stool sample would look completely different. So it's just like, they're not able to take that into account in studies at the moment. They need to really.
Yeah.
So it's kind of,
and that circadian disruption. So if you are that shift worker, and you get the disruption in your light and your darkness exposure, and then you might change your meal time. So you might be eating throughout the night instead of during the day. Those are going to be triggering the clocks in your body differently, and that will result in this imbalance of the gut microbiome. So we tend to see more of those pro-inflammatory bacteria, the ones that thrive when we're eating more, and the ones that thrive when we're eating more of the wrong types of foods as well. And we tend to see much fewer of the beneficial microbes, like those lactobacilli that need those strong rhythms. And that, of course, reduces our production of short-chain fatty acids. And that can lead to problems with our gut lining. Because our gut lining is dependent on our gut microbiome being in harmony and having that lovely balance between the good guys and the bad guys. And so when we up the inflammatory bacteria in the gut, and we increase the amount of toxins produced by them, but we're not then balancing it with the good guys because they've really diminished, we end up with an increased permeability of the gut wall, this leaky gut, which can allow more of these bacteria into the gut, into the bloodstream, and their toxins, which can create inflammation around the body. And that dysbiosis can also disrupt your clock genes in the body, and that can have an impact on the blood-brain barrier as well, which again is this very sort of thin barrier between the bloodstream and the actual brain. And we rely on this being relatively tight to keep our brain super healthy so that we're not just allowing any old toxins, any old bacteria into the brain. But when we're in this circadian disrupted state, we're more likely to have more of these inflammatory bacteria, more of their toxins, and they're going to damage the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier, and create problems for us there, with more bacteria toxins into the brain. So that might account for my fuzzy headedness when I'm sleep deprived. I can't concentrate.
I mean, big shout out to these shift workers, okay? Because we need these people. These are the cleaners, the maintenance guy, the transport, the healthcare professionals, the people who are doing all this stuff to make our lives great, and they're doing them at, shifts that take them all over the place. I think it's really important that they're actually, higher risk of, chronic disease because of this. And I think we need to start taking this into account. And I know that Professor Russell Foster, he's the sleep guy at Oxford, lovely book called Lifetime. So if you've got, he is really passionate about this and passionate about, two things really. One is shift workers, and the other thing is about when we take our drugs, and that we've got to know, what the best time people taking medications for efficacy and toxicity is. So really recommend that book, and we'll put all these studies that we're alluding to in the show notes because it's a really interesting area. I suppose I don't want everyone out there who's doing shift work to think, my goodness, this is terrible, because actually there are a lot of, things we can do to alter to improve the circadian rhythm quickly, and to, take this into consideration. So
and I think we definitely need to touch on that. But I think first of all, we're going to talk about solutions shortly. But I think first of all, the other thing that we want to bring into this, because we've talked about sleep, we've talked about circadian rhythms, but I really want to bring in food here, because food actually has a big impact, and we haven't really mentioned it so far, but your meal times and your food choices will also impact on your circadian rhythms and your circadian clocks in the body. So Shiv, tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, this is a huge subject. I mean, we'd need a lot more time, but if we just give you an idea, should we do a framework? Okay, so I'm going to divide it into there's the quality and quantity of food, and this idea of food patterns, which we'll talk about, and then we'll go on to some specific nutrients. Should we do that? Mm-hmm. So if we talk about broadly, we know that it's just not just eating in general, it's actually the importance of the quality of your food. So if I take two common food patterns, so we've got this idea that shortcut for a healthy diet is this Mediterranean diet. It's kind of whole food, plant-based. And the opposite would be the Western diet, or the standard American diet, which if you sort of think of a picture that's crowded with, pizza, fake junk food, chips, lots of sweets. And those sort of contain a lot of these ultra-processed foods. They're high fat, high sugar. And when you look at the evidence, again, we'll put the papers in the show notes, they're associated broadly with lighter fragmented sleep, increased insomnia, increased sleep disorders, and also heavy, high-fat late meals, again, linked to poorer sleep quality and insomnia. So there's those broad patterns that's really, really important. And then you've got this other area of specific nutrients. So the two that most of you will be aware of are coffee and alcohol. So we know that when you have lots of coffee, it takes you longer to fall asleep, but it also disrupts and fragments the whole of your sleep architecture. Sheena briefly took you through this idea that overnight you have this beautiful sleep rhythms and architecture, and you're varying between the depth of your sleep, how much rapid eye movement sleep to how much non-rapid eye movement sleep. And it really matters, because while this beautiful orchestrated dance is going on at night, there's different things happening at different stages, and the ratios of all these stages really matter. And, coffee disrupts all that. There was a meta-analysis that showed, I was quite surprised actually, I think it was like 45 minutes disruption if you're taking caffeine, and it was advising that you should have your last coffee 8.8 hours before you sleep. And I know that different people metabolize at different rates, but I hear a lot of people going, oh, coffee doesn't disrupt my sleep. But actually, when they look, even those people who think it doesn't disrupt their sleep, it does. And that brings us to alcohol. And that's even more of a problem, because lots of people find that it helps them get to sleep. And there is, some science to back that it does make you sleep quicker, but your architecture is terrible. So it disrupts this ratios, you get fragmentation, you think you're sleeping, but actually you're not sleeping. The quality of your sleep is not great. Chronic alcohol use is really associated, and you start to get insomnia. So it's kind of real problem, because everyone thinks it helps, but it doesn't.
And it knocks out your REM sleep, doesn't it? Yeah. Which is that processing bit of sleep. Yes. So again, it's going to really affect your moods and emotions if you can't then process properly in the night.
And anxiety, is processed during that time. So, you're not, really emotional regulation. So a lot of emotional regulation goes on there. You get a good night's sleep. You're not so anxious the next day. But then, Sheena, you've got this whole kind of range, a shelf of other things, which you hear the biohackers talking about. You're talking about ashwagandha, glycine, melatonin, obviously. And then you've got magnesium's kind of a big one at the moment. And there's probably the best thing I could do is point people to a paper that was done by Frederica Conti, an Australian dietitian, which I thought was a really good comprehensive literature review of it all. So they pulled out all the things where there was evidence. So things like melatonin, magnesium, omega-3s as well. Things like kiwi, tart cherry juice, valerian roots, ashwagandha. And it actually sort of went through all the evidence and did a lovely chart of the strength of evidence for everything. So there was, so these things do have small effects. So it's not that they won't help. But I think if you've got a terrible lifestyle, you're, shift working, you're, drinking, you're having coffee at the wrong time, you're having terrible food, and then you expect, a small bit of tart cherry juice to do all that, I don't think it's going to work. But I think if you're adding these things on top of, improving lifestyle pillars as well, I think it could be. So there's good evidence for melatonin, magnesium, tart cherry juice, kiwi juice, omega-3s, glycine, ashwagandha, less evidence. But again, sometimes that's because there hasn't been a lot of studies done in all these other things as well. It's maybe. But take a look at that paper if you want to know more about that. But I suppose I want to move on to, those are, the quality, the quantity, the specific nutrients. But in this, we were talking about circadian rhythms and this kind of 24-hour variation in cycles. And we like this whole area of chrononutrition. It's not just what you eat, it's when you eat. Because Sheena, earlier you were saying that the superchiasmatic nucleus takes messages from day and light, the amount of light there is, the food, and when you're exercising. But your gut microbes, the main Zeitgeber, that's the kind of cue, is food when you are eating. And I kind of thought that was really interesting, because this conference we were at, we were talking about mental health disorders, and it's known people with mental health disorders, there's a lot of a struggle with circadian rhythms. They have mistimed irregular meals, they miss meals altogether. And that's really common. And if that's blunting your circadian rhythms, and it's blunting your microbial rhythms, then that's going to worsen your mood. That's going to worsen your sleep. That's going to worsen your metabolic health. And there's this big issue with mental illness. We kind of put the body in one box and mental illness in the other, but the biological mechanisms for both are the same. So those people who are suffering from mental health disorders, they have a much higher rate of comorbidities. So particularly cardiometabolic disorders and diabetes. And, there is this big connection. Absolutely. You've got to think of it in one way. So, there's not been a lot done on combining all these because it's crazily complex. So there's not many studies on food and sleep and mood, but
there is some. There was. I don't know if anybody here has heard of the biobank study, but basically the biobank study is a big study that's been done in the UK between 2006 and 2010. They enrolled over 500,000 people, and they were mainly middle-aged and older people. And they gave them very detailed questionnaires on diet, on sleep, on mental health. And then they compared them. So sadly, only 7.9% of these individuals actually had a healthy diet, which is sad, but probably representative of this country as a whole. But interesting, that healthy diet score did in fact correlate with a better sleep and improved mental health. And it's not just the healthy diet score. So when we compared our fiber intake, and obviously as microbiome medics, we're really interested in fiber because of the short chain fatty acid production. But interestingly, that higher fiber intake was associated with a better night's sleep. And this study actually even looked at your milk intake, which is interesting to see how your milk intake compared to your sleep quality. And interesting, if you had a moderate intake of milk, you actually slept better, whereas a lower intake or even a higher intake of milk was associated with that poorer sleep quality. And then they looked at mental health and how that correlates with food. And they found that if you have a better quality of diet, that was associated with fewer mental health symptoms, so better mental health. And again, with the fiber, there was that clear correlation between that high fiber diet and much better mental health, fewer mental health symptoms. And again, interestingly, with the milk, that moderate intake seems to be the sweet spot, with low intake and a high intake associated with a greater number of mental health symptoms. So, yeah, interesting. I mean, obviously just correlating between questionnaires and questionnaires, how reliable are they? But, it's an interesting study that's been done. And I suppose it does fit with what we would imagine would be the case with our knowledge on microbiome, with the milk being an interesting one to consider. I think we've got to move on really to think about, well, we've tied sleep with circadian rhythms, with food, and with our mental health, and we found that they're all quite correlated. But Shiv, what solutions do we have for all of this?
Yeah, well, I suppose we've got to establish whether, if we improve our sleep, will it improve our mood? What's the evidence there? And again, I suppose one of the best ones I've seen is a recent meta-analysis where they collated 65 randomized control trials. And these are randomized control trials at the higher end of the evidence triangle. So people like them. They see them as robust. So this was a good meta-analysis, and it incorporated, I think, about 8,000 people. But they felt their conclusion was that poor sleep was causally related to mental health difficulties. If you improve your sleep, you're improving your mood. But the important thing they added here was this dose-response relationship. So what I mean by that is the more you improve your sleep, the more you improve your mood. So I kind of think that's really important because that means that we can move on to saying, well, actually, let's, if we improve your sleep, then we can, really focus on the mood. I think that's
And I think important. That should be really fundamental for all the clinicians out there. When you're dealing with somebody who has a mood disorder, really question them about their sleep and find out about their sleep, because that could be one of the first things you consider trying to improve in these individuals. And this is what I do primarily with a lot of our patients presenting with anxiety and depression. I try to fix their sleep first and foremost. And the other, consideration is those meal timings and things. So, I think that can make a huge difference to people's mental health.
Absolutely. And there certainly are some people doing some really interesting research in outpatients and inpatients where they're not just treating the mood disorder with, drugs. They're actually trying to look at the whole thing, aligning the circadian rhythm, trying to do all that stuff. And there's really exciting work in that regard. But we probably can't go into this a lot. But if we just, let me put it this way. So we're looking at sleep interventions. I'm going to divide them into two. So I'm going to just have a quick overview of behavioural stuff. And then Sheena, I'm going to hand over to you to look at what the microbiome interventions are. Is that okay? Should we do that? So most of you will have heard of sleep hygiene. It's all over the kind of TikTok and Instagram and all the sort of wellness magazines and things, sort of saying that these are behavioural environmental factors which you can control, which are known to influence your sleep outcomes. So we've already alluded to a couple. So things like the caffeine intake and that 8.8 hours between your last coffee and your sleep. When you go to bed, also avoiding large, fatty, ultra-processed meals before bed. And people argue about the exact, but it's certainly 2, preferably 3. Some people even say 4 hours, stop eating before you go to bed. And it's this whole idea of having, regular habits. Sheena was talking about the social jet lag. It would be better if we kept the same regime even over the weekends. Making your room just for sleep, nothing else. When you exercise is important as well, reducing your stress. We haven't even started talking about social media, phones in bedrooms, kids. I can't remember, it's like 70% of 12-year-olds have the phones in their bed, smartphones. So, we'll talk about that another time maybe. But there's all those things which are all very interesting. And then there's this CBTI for insomnia, which has been really exciting as a treatment, really effective treatment, where it takes all that stuff about sleep hygiene, it adds cognitive behavioral therapy, it adds things like stimulus control, sleep restriction therapy, so that, for example, if you can't get your sleep right, so you end up conking out in the afternoon, so then you can't sleep at night, it takes you through how to slowly alter that. Relaxation techniques. So if you do wake in the middle of the night, how you can relax. But if you can't sleep, then just get up, get out of the room. And a nice way they're doing this is with various apps. In Scotland, do they have a Sleepio app in Scotland? Yeah, Scotland. Sleepio app. Again, that's the Oxford group that I spoke about, Professor Russell, but his colleague Colin Espy was involved in this. And it's, it's really taken off. It's excellent. So it's an app that takes you through this. So you got your own, little guide, and it's in the NICE guidelines. So that's, clearly very, very important. So those things are really, really important. They've got a brilliant evidence base, but we want to add to that really. We want to, just talk about what can the gut microbiome and this other stuff do. So
I think we thought that's great, and a lot of it makes a lot of sense, and obviously highly evidence based. But what they're missing is that microbial component. And so if we shift the emphasis to our microbes and try to think about how we can harness their power to alter our clock genes and to improve our physiology, and then that can really enhance all of this. So we want to think about gut microbiome friendly diets. So we want to up our fiber, because we know from the biobank study that high fiber diet is going to get us to a better quality of sleep. And we want to increase things like fermentation, fermented foods, because they contain those lovely lactobacilli, which have those lovely diurnal variations in their function, and they're going to be big short chain fatty acid producers for us. And we probably want to minimize, ultra processed foods and fatty, sugary foods, which are actually more likely to create that imbalance in our gut, which can then create the feedback to the circadian clocks to disrupt them. So that's important. We want to consider probiotics and fermented foods, which we haven't talked about up until now, and then chrononutrition, which Shiv has mentioned briefly. So these are all important things. So if we look at probiotics, because lots of people are interested in probiotics now, and whether or not they are associated with benefits. And probiotics obviously are these live bacteria that have been shown to give us health benefits. So it can't be any old live bacteria. They've had to be enrolled in a clinical study and actually shown a health benefit. And there are actually 4 meta-analyses that have been done on this, on the association between your probiotics and sleep. And they do conclude that there are various microbes that are very beneficial. So lactobacilli, bifidobacteria, and Saccharomyces are 3 strains that are associated with having a positive impact on your sleep quality. And also reducing that daytime sleepiness. So hopefully improving that depth of sleep that you're getting into. And interestingly, insomnia is associated with that lack of lactobacilli and that lack of bifidobacteria and the production of short-chain fatty acids. So it all sort of ties in very nicely that there is that benefit. And those 3 strains, although you can buy them as probiotics, and there are probably many supplements out there, it's worth remembering that you get these strains in fermented foods. There's fewer studies on fermented foods. I guess it's much harder to do nutritional studies than it is to give a pill. But so there's not as many studies there to back that up on the fermented food side. But if you drink kefir, for example, you're going to get lactobacilli, you're going to get bifido, you're going to get Saccharomyces in that kefir. So most of your fermented foods will give you these strains, and that may help you, though we don't have the studies. There's one study that we found on fermented foods and sleep quality, and that was a Polish study that looked at medical students under exam stress. And they looked at, it was, again, questionnaire based, how much fermented foods are you consuming in a day? And obviously Poland is a better consumer of fermented foods than we are in the UK, because they're more likely to eat things like sauerkraut and things. But they noticed that a moderate intake of fermented foods was associated with better sleep quality. So again, seems to be this sweet spot. If you are not consuming very many fermented foods, you're not going to get the benefit. Well, if you overdo the fermented foods, maybe that's a little bit too much for your system. We don't know why, but that seems to be associated with a dip in your sleep quality. I guess that's something that maybe somebody could look into.
Yeah, I think it's kind of just to pause there and just sort of explore this area a bit, because I think it's frustrating for some people who like fermented foods and they just go, well, why can't we just take fermented foods? And I suppose it's this thing where it's this thing about the randomized controlled trials and having to know and having to prove. And if you, for example, look at fermented foods, so if Sheena has, makes some, kefir, and I make some kefir down in Church Stretton, what we're making might seem the same, might look the same, might even taste quite similar, but they've got completely different environmental conditions, light, oxygen, what we're putting in, other microbes popping in. So if you analyze both those kefirs, they will have similarities, but they will be very different. And when you're doing essentially a drug trial, then you can't compare Sheena's with mine because there's differences. So that's where the problems come with fermented food trials, So the thing is with the probiotics, it's very, very standardized. It's exactly the same. So if you're giving 2 groups of patients, you're giving one a probiotic and one a placebo, so a sham pill, then they know that all those patients are getting exactly the same number of lactobacilli, bifidobacilli. Yeah. But it is a bit frustrating, isn't it? Because you think
it's really tricky.
Yeah.
And again, well, you've got to wonder, well, if there aren't the studies, but it makes sense that these fermented foods contain these bacteria that are showing up in the studies being positively associated with good sleep, then it makes sense in my head to just try the fermented foods. It's cheaper, it's easier to access. And you can play around with fermented foods, It's not going to do you any harm to try different things and see whether any of them have a positive impact on you.
It's very safe, and they're packed full of other, brilliant plant bioactives.
And not all of them will suit you. You may find that some just upset your gut or annoy your gut, and maybe, some just cause you other symptoms. Who knows? But essentially,
that's an important point there, because sometimes when you hear us talk about fermented, it feels like you have to have it, and if you don't like, something wrong with you. If you don't, what don't you like?
Well,
you don't like.
I'm not a fan of sauerkraut.
Yeah.
But
and that's
my friend Janice does make some amazing sauerkrauts. But But it's funny because I don't think I've ever been in the habit of eating sauerkraut regularly. So I don't have a meal necessarily that I naturally put sauerkraut on. So for me, it's quite clunky to actually add it into my diet. Whereas, yogurts, kefirs and things add into my diet much more easily. Kombucha, I can easily, have in my diet.
I suppose the message is two things. One is that just saying I don't like sauerkraut, there are so many different types of sauerkraut. And this friend of yours, Janice, says she can do a mild one, she can do different textures, and there will be one you will like. But, you don't have sauerkraut, that's absolutely fine. There's so many others. So just explore and don't feel that you have to have, be taking natto, which apparently, I've never tried natto.
That's the one I haven't tried.
But everyone says it's quite, so you don't have to have stuff you don't like, but maybe explore that a bit.
So that's one aspect. So we probably recommend that you consider adding a bit more fermented foods to your diet and see how you go, but maybe just don't overdo the fermented foods. And then on the chrononutrition side, obviously Shiv's already mentioned this. How when you have your meals is important, and actually, in shift workers, they've actually done studies where they have time restricted their meals, and actually they've regained some of that circadian balance back, which is interesting. So essentially, if you are eating throughout the night and you're a shift worker, you're likely to be disrupting your circadian rhythms further. And sleep charities will advise you that actually we should be bringing this back in and trying to keep to fairly regular eating patterns, even though you're then working through the night. And that will help to maintain those circadian rhythms. But in addition, if you try to narrow that window of eating, so you're not eating for a long, sprawly amount of time throughout the day, like 16-hour period. Instead, you're eating for a much shorter period of time, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours in the day. But that leaves you a nice sort of 12-hour plus window where you're not eating, you're essentially fasting. You're going to then encourage these lovely microbes like the lactobacilli to be hard at work for you, producing those short-chain fatty acids. And that shows in the trials. So this sort of constant snacking, this late-night eating, this longer eating windows in the daytime are associated with this imbalance in the gut microbiome, dysbiosis, reduction in short-chain fatty acids, more pro-inflammatory bacteria, and it worsens your sleep and your mood. Whereas if we get into these lovely regular patterns of eating, we keep our eating window relatively small, so that we're not eating for long periods of time, and we avoid constant snacking and eating before bed, then we're going to help our gut microbiome to thrive. And that is associated with a healthier gut microbiome, a greater production of short-chain fatty acids, and fewer of these pro-inflammatory bacteria.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
that was kind of really interesting looking around it. I mean, there's lots of great people doing great research in this area, and there's lots of brilliant books actually. What would you say were your two favourite sleep books? And any recommendations?
Well, I love Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep. And, I have read that book 4 times. It's a brilliant book. It really goes into depths on the physiology. But he's a wizard when it comes to sleep. And he's got a podcast now as well. So you can access it through the podcast. But he's great to listen to. He's a smart guy. I've got various sleep books downstairs on sleep disorders and various things like this. But I think you've looked into the circadian.
Well, there's 2 ones I want to add to that. So I think he was the first, Matthew Walker. So the only slight criticism that some people had afterwards, which he admits himself, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I think he brought sleep into everyone's consciousness. Before that, it was just like, why would you sleep? It's a waste of time. And it's just like blew that out of the water. So there is another one by Professor Russell Foster, which I mentioned, Lifetime. Again, another beautiful book. He's done some really interesting work in the photoreceptors in your eyes, and is just, phenomenal read. Again, he's really focused on shift workers, but that is another really fantastic book that goes through a lot of these things that we've been discussing and really worth looking at. And then there's Sachin Panda, who's got the Circadian Code, which is another really, really good book. So he's really interested, and he does a lot on time-restricted eating and circadian rhythms. And again,
Chrononutrition.
Yeah, and all these people are really beautiful communicators. So these are people who've been decades of work, incredible level of research, right at the top of their game. And then they produce these books that distill decades of work. And, the way they communicate with people is fantastic. And I love this idea that people going straight to the public and, giving this information in such a beautiful and easy to understand way. So, and then you mentioned the sleep charity. That's worth looking at, isn't it?
It is worth looking at. Sleep Charity's got some really good information. And again, information for shift workers I got from the sleep charities.
Yeah.
And, I think that is really, really useful.
Yes, if you look on that, any of these things you're thinking, that sounds a bit worrying. But also to say that we are incredibly resilient. So if there's any parents out there who are up all hours thinking, my goodness, actually, people have been having kids throughout evolution and across, history. So there is an incredible resilience there. But of course, we had the family around. So there was this idea that everyone would be helping out. So we don't have that anymore. We live in a city far away from our parents. So it's, you're stuck with looking after. Whereas when you had these communities, people were able to, pass the care between people. You looked after it as a community, as the newborn. So it's kind of, worth reflecting on. But your body is resilient. And, if you alter some small things, you can flip it back into the right rhythm. So there's just so much hope there and so many things you can do, so many great hacks, one of which is, realigning your food and the focus on your gut microbiome. So,
And I think that's our message. When you're thinking about your sleep, remember that your sleep is tied to your mood. Your sleep is tied to your food, your nutrition. It's also there's these tri-directional links between all of these things. And your exposure to light and dark. Again, we're not very good at that. We stay indoors so much nowadays. But these things are really important to us and our physiology. So don't think of sleep in isolation. Don't think of mood in isolation. Don't think of your diet in isolation. Remember, all these things are connected. And try to consider your body as a whole and be holistic with it. And if your mood's off, think about what could be triggering that. What's your sleep like? What's your diet like? All of these things. What's your eating pattern like?
Getting that morning light, getting up, and if you're feeling low and you think, I don't want to go and exercise, actually just get your cup of tea, stand outside on your porch and just listen to the birds, get that light in. And that's something that,
And if you're not sure what's triggering it, just go back to basics and just try to get those nice regular rhythms going with your meals, your sleep. Just try and fix that first and then see how you feel.
And that's what this conference was about, that, instead of just honing in on the diagnosis of depression and the pharmaceutical drug that may or may not help, it's just going wide. And all these things may have 5, 10, 15%, but you add all that together. You look at your time in nature, you look at your time, getting up and getting sun in your eyes and your chrononutrition and when you're eating your meals and your physical activity, and you start this journey and you start putting all these things together, then, things unfold and the collective improvement can be impressive.
Yeah. Brilliant.
It has been an absolute joy. We love the conference, but Sheena, it's just so nice sitting on the sofa with you.
It is.
We just, this so rarely happens. We've got to do it more. I guess we'll sign off now.
Thanks. And thanks for coming to Glasgow. I need to come to you next time. I love Glasgow.
Yeah, definitely.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Microbiome Medics podcast. We really hope you enjoyed the content and we welcome your feedback. We'd love to hear any suggestions you might have for microbiome topics that you'd like us to cover. And we also appreciate listeners' questions and will endeavour to answer them in the next podcast.